Tom Fitton is president of the conservative nonprofit watchdog group Judicial Watch, which you'll hear has an impressive record for prying public documents from the grip of stingy federal officials who try to withhold them. I've been following the group's work for many years, and my reporting has sometimes been better with the benefit of documents that Judicial Watch has been able to get from the federal government. But today, Fenton joins us primarily to sort through all the static of the court cases against Donald Trump, what they're about, where they stand, and where all of this may be headed. For people who might not be familiar, what is Judicial Watch?
Judicial Watch is a nonprofit educational foundation. We're a charity that seeks to expose what the government's up to. We hold the government accountable where we can through the legal process. And in doing so, we're educating the American people about our Constitution, our government, and public policy generally.
I will toot your horn for just a moment. I think you're described as, maybe you consider yourself sometimes, a conservative group, but as I've followed you over the years, you have, I think, been the single most successful group in getting freedom of information material from our government under both Democrat and Republican administrations. Really important stuff. What would you have to say about how you were described?
Well, we are conservative. I mean, we use tools that the left in some ways created. I mean, FOIA is a creature of the left for many, many years, the Freedom of Information Act, the open records laws. That's a reform that came from the left. And, we ask questions that the left doesn't want to answer sometimes of both Republican and Democrat administrations. And as conservatives, we recognize that when government engages pretty much in anything, there's going to be an issue. And usually when they engage in big things, there's going to be big issues. And so that's why we demand transparency, and we have a conservative approach that's skeptical of government activity. And as a result, they try to tar us with the name conservative. But, what's wrong with being questioning a government? And I don't understand politically why transparency would be controversial for anyone. I mean, in the end, that's all we're doing is we're asking questions, getting government documents. How could that be offensive to anyone?
Well, the wrongdoers, perhaps.
Yes, well, we all know that.
We're here to talk about these lawsuits against Donald Trump, and I'm really glad I follow you and get your emails from Judicial Watch that you guys dissect a lot of stuff that other people aren't doing. And it's very easy for people to find the negative stuff, that side of the story about the Donald Trump cases. I mean, that's simple. And I urge people, do any kind of Google search you want to read up on that if you want to know more about it. But you're doing and uncovering material that's on the other side. So before we dig into some of that and have you explain to us some of these complicated cases in simple detail, does Judicial Watch get any money from the Trump campaign or donations, or is this just something you're interested in as a conservative foundation?
Well, I don't discuss where we get money from, other than to say that my saying I don't discuss where we get money from doesn't mean we get money from the Trump campaign. Can't take that as a yes or a no.
Okay.
But this is the sort of work we just do in the ordinary course. And I hope that makes it clear to people. We're going to do this because of the corruption and the abuse and targeting of Trump, not because, we believe that Trump should be the president or that we believe that Trump's policies are the best policies. This isn't a policy discussion. This is a rule of law question about whether someone like President Trump is going to be protected under the law or be abused.
I think a lot of people are very concerned about what's happened in our court system in recent decades, where we've come to feel like ordinary people, or let's say people who are fighting a government accusation of some kind, sometimes feel like they have no chance for many different reasons. Maybe the courts lean toward taking the government's viewpoint on stuff. Maybe the courts are filled with judges who are not fair or even compromised. I've read a lot of background and startling stuff about that. Maybe the court systems just they're not set up anymore to handle cases quickly, efficiently, and fairly when it comes to the citizen side of the story, when most of us don't have the money that and the resources the government does. Can you just briefly describe what's going on in court with Donald Trump right now? It seems like, just in time for the 2024 campaign, there are all of these things coming up that are intended to tar him. And I'm sure the anti-Trump people would say rightly so. But of course, a lot of people see this as something that appears politically driven.
I've tried to come up with an analysis, Sharyl, that would help people figure out whether a prosecution or a targeting of a politician is on the up and up. And one of the kind of the triggers or issues that I think people should consider when trying to figure that out is saying, okay, now who's the person being targeted and who's doing the targeting? So that should raise a little bit of skepticism. It doesn't mean it doesn't mean you're immune from scrutiny because your political opponents control the levers of prosecution and investigation. But it should raise an issue. And then more importantly, are they doing things in a way, are they holding the person to account for standards that no one else has been held to account for? Are they making up new rules? And more specifically, in the case of Trump, are they engaging in prosecutions and investigative steps that are unprecedented and involve the novel application of law, meaning applying the law in a way that's never been applied before in the history of the United States of America for practical purposes? And all of those are yes, 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 right? And it tells you that this is a corrupt scheme, in my view. And it's the simplest explanation is the Democratic Party that controls the levers of power in the Justice Department through the Biden White House and their Democratic Party allies, all of whom are elected in Fulton County and in New York City and in New York State, are working to target a political opponent of what I would call the regime. And it's like nothing we've ever seen before in American history. We've seen some of it in American history, right? It's not to say there's never been political targeting in terms of prosecutions previously. We've had a third-party presidential candidate essentially jailed for a period of time. But to have a major party political candidate, a former president, have all these privileges torn asunder and have the law applied in ways that have never been applied before, in a way that maybe even outside the law in terms of the elasticity that is being applied. They're stretching the law in such a way that it breaks. To me, tells you everything you need to know. And kind of, on the base level, if you want to know what's going on and just how decrepit things have become, look to see what's happened in the last 2 or 3 days up in New York with Stormy Daniels on the stand. That's what they're doing to Trump. And to me, that's a kind of Stormy Daniels is a mascot for the Biden prosecutions of Trump. It's that salacious and so outside the realms of decency and the rule of law.
Well, I think there was a time when, and maybe this is still a large opinion we're just not hearing speak out, when there would have been, even if there was an idea that Donald Trump did some of these things that could be wrong or illegal, the prosecutors or those who make decisions would still tend to err on the side of not prosecuting if there was any latitude, because they would want to avoid the appearance of looking like they're targeting a political enemy, because that's such a serious thing. At least it used to always be. And now there is no wide berth. Clearly, they are trying to find anything they can. They're doing quite the opposite to try to go after Donald Trump. Can you describe, a lot of people don't have time to get up to speed and watch a bunch of TV and read a bunch of articles. Can you describe in simple terms for people who don't know much what that hush money trial, as it's called, is about and who Stormy Daniels is?
Well, several years ago, Trump's lawyer, Mr. Cohen, made a payment to Stormy Daniels as part of a confidentiality agreement. And reportedly, Trump reimbursed him, deemed it a legal expense, and booked it as a legal expense. And as Michael Cohen, his lawyer, became subject to criminal investigation, those looking at those expenses, including some of Trump's enemies in the Justice Department under Mueller, et cetera, started making noise about the political campaign side of it. Oh, was this a political contribution or expense that should have been reported? And they all just kind of gave it a pass because it typically isn't the type of expense that would necessarily be reported. And but that wasn't good enough for the left. So Alvin Bragg was elected, and there was significant political pressure on him to bring charges in this regard. So what are typically misdemeanors, and for which the statute of limitations has passed, and I'm not a lawyer, I'm just kind of basing this on my general understanding of what's gone on. The way to kind of get over that statute of limitations hurdle is to pretend, I'm calling it pretend, they'll say allege, that the alleged misdemeanors here of deeming these expenses as legal expenses, as opposed to, I'm not sure what else they would have been deemed, were all part of some type of conspiracy, although they don't use the word conspiracy, but it was done in furtherance of a violation of another law. They still haven't really told us what that other law is. The presumption is federal election law. Sometimes they mention conspiracy. That wasn't in the indictment. Sometimes they mention state election law. Of course, that wasn't the issue. So it's just crazy in that regard. So it's really an indictment about nothing. And now it's been week 4. We're in the 4th week of this, and they still haven't introduced any evidence of a crime by Trump. We've heard the details of the alleged sexual encounter with Stormy Daniels, which, most honest legal observers say would be enough in any normal trial to cause a mistrial, because it's so provocative and disruptive to the gathering of only probative evidence that's supposed to be the basis for a decision that's legitimate, as opposed to inflammatory evidence like that has nothing to do with anything. And that's where we are right now. And in the meantime, Trump is being gagged in an unprecedented fashion by the judge. So Stormy Daniels is having these headlines all over the nation, and he's facing jail, Trump is, if he makes any noise objecting to what she said or criticizing her involvement here or the involvement of other witnesses. It's just incredible.
I think the gag order is a remarkable development that I'm amazed by. And also, I'm not a lawyer, but the notion that someone who is accused and arguably being smeared, and has been in the past accused and smeared with false information, is gagged from saying certain things that, in his own defense, as he's running for president, it's just a stunning development to me as a journalist.
Yeah, and think about it, Sharyl. It's not just him who's gagged. His whole campaign becomes gagged. So we have this, and the judge in New York, by the way, and it's not a criticism, it's a fact, is a politician. He ran for his office, and he's a Democratic Party politician. Alvin Bragg is a Democratic Party politician who ran for his office. And the judge gave a campaign donation to Biden and funded other radical left-wing groups while he was on the bench. So you have a Democratic Party politician in New York essentially take control of the Trump campaign on this key issue. As far as I'm concerned, Trump is a political hostage up there. He can't leave the court when it's in session. So Trump, Biden's able to campaign freely to the extent he even wants to campaign or is capable of doing it. And Trump's is stuck campaigning outside the courtroom door most days of the week. Incredible.
What's the controversy over the New York judge's daughter? And I think this is one of the things Trump is not allowed to talk about.
Well, the daughter is a Democratic Party operative. She's a vendor for the Democratic Party and politicians. So she makes money by working with them. And some of the works involve direct attacks and references to Trump's legal problems, including the issues up in New York. And under the recusal standards in New York, my understanding is, that's close enough to the judge in terms of family as to raise a recusal requirement. And he's just ignored that requirement. And the challenge for Trump is that, the courts are either not acting, are essentially pocket vetoing a lot of what he's concerned about, or basically largely ignoring his complaints about this process. And, that's the challenge. My understanding is generally, once you're indicted in any jurisdiction, the federal courts are a little bit more slow, but the state courts, they're like a train. It leaves the station and it rarely stops until the jury renders a verdict. And then your appeals begin typically. And so, Trump may be stuck there until the verdict. And if the verdict goes south on him, we may not know for years whether he gets vindicated in the end over the abuses I'm highlighting.
Let's move on to the Atlanta case. This, again, just as an outside observer, in terms of the appearance of a conflict of interest, I'm stunned we have another judge in a case that saw the prosecutor's conflicts of interest that they have with each other. And I know they were parsing whether this prosecutor who hired the prosecutor prosecuting Trump, whether they had an affair before or after the hiring and so on. And to me, I didn't think that mattered. There's a conflict either way. If there's implied favors or benefit between them, either before the hiring or even if it started occurring after the hiring, they were really parsing details over that. In the end, the judge saw apparently an apparent conflict of interest and then just said, my understanding is, well, the woman who did the hiring can, recuse herself or not and decide what to do to go further. I don't know. It was so confusing because I just feel like that whole office is compromised, or at least, again, it's not just a conflict of interest in the law that's considered. It's the appearance of a conflict of interest. And certainly there is an appearance here. Can you talk a little bit about that case?
Yes, and you raise an important point because I've highlighted the sort of the novel application of the law, all of which is there in Georgia, where Trump is being prosecuted and other Americans are being prosecuted for engaging in the act of disputing an election, which is their right under the Constitution, under state and federal law. And never before have we started prosecuting people for questioning the results of an election and demanding accountability for an election process in a state. And that echoes, so people know, what Trump is facing from the feds up here in New York under Jack Smith and the Biden Justice Department. There's kind of a case similar in New York that the Biden administration is pursuing, trying to jail Trump for challenging Biden's election. Just incredible. It's just to describe it is to condemn it. But on top of all of that political corruption, you have this base personal corruption of Fani Willis basically having a boyfriend that she hires and then keeps working on this unprecedented massive prosecution of Trump. And so you had him helping run grand juries and running the indictment and such. And, the questions raised, well, was all of this activity to keep money flowing and their presence up in the public? And, they start arguing over, well, we split dates or that's as if that's relevant. Exactly. He was getting money he otherwise wouldn't have been able to get because of this contract with her. And, and all of that was contingent on these, as I highlight, these fake charges against Trump. So not only were they politically fake, but they were generated in part, it's clear, to provide cash to take care of the district attorney, Fani Willis, and her then boyfriend, Mr. Wade. And I don't even know what their status is, but the judge required that Mr. Wade had to leave, and that would solve the conflict issue and sanctify the case. I don't think the case is redeemable for a variety of reasons, as discussed.
And in the big picture, again, whatever happened in 2020 aside, I ask, because I think it's raised this question, let's not discuss that in this hypothetical. Let's say hypothetically in the future, an election, there is massive cheating. Someone is elected on the basis of votes that likely didn't really occur. If the person who was cheated is not allowed to say anything, or if the public who believes that happened or even knows that happened isn't allowed to protest or urge Congress to do something about it or speak out, if that's all deemed to be illegal, then what are we left with? We've basically given a green light for cheaters to take elections because we've said nobody can do anything about it after the fact.
Oh, I think that's exactly the right analysis. It's to punish for past conduct, meaning how dare you question the Biden regime, and to guarantee that fewer people will question future elections if something similar happens or something even worse happens. And
Although if Trump wins again, I've been talking to people who predict there will be a questioning of that by the people who said you can't question elections. And
oh, that's true, right? And that's the
happen
hilarity of it. They're already planning to contest his election, and the results aren't in yet.
All right, let's move on to the.
But I don't know if you saw the Washington Post this week. The headline is Republicans refuse to say whether they'll accept the results of the election.
We're back where we were in 20.
Why is that the rule?
Right.
If, as you point out, if the results are compromised and there's legal reason to challenge them, why would anyone just commit to anything of that nature prior to you knowing what happened?
Listen, I think it's suspicious in retrospect that around, I believe it was April of 2020, out of the blue, people started going on news programs, sort of analysts and liberal analysts saying, it could be weeks or months before we know the outcome, or even longer of this election. They started laying the groundwork for something that no one had asked about. Like, why are you raising it this early? And I think you could again, in retrospect, say there was a plan, and we can argue between ourselves over what the plan was, but certainly they saw by April of 2020 that Trump, was likely to win again. And I think that they were putting, chess pieces in place at the time. But let's move on to the Florida case of the confidential documents that supposedly Trump had, that I guess they didn't care that Biden had his because he's honest and didn't mean anything. And they just trust his attorney's words that he turned them all in the second that he knew of them, which there's no way to know any of that's true. I guess it's okay that Pence had some because Pence is an honest guy and immediately notified, according to him, notified when he found out, and he's to be trusted that everything is true. But when it comes to Trump, who actually was actively negotiating over this, he wasn't hiding the fact, he was disputing and negotiating which documents he was allowed to have. All of a sudden, he's arrested and raided, with what we know happened at Mar-a-Lago. What's going on with that case, and what are your thoughts about it?
Well, to bring people up to date, that case is not likely to go to trial until after the election, if not next year. So the big issue is, did Trump as president have a right to select any records he wanted to and take them with him, in effect? And that had been the law prior to the new rules, as you highlight, used against Trump. And, we have a special insight here because we kind of took the approach that, no, well, that can't be right? Because we had found out that Bill Clinton was interviewed by an author in the White House, and there were recordings made of these interviews, and the recordings included audio and taping of him being president, calling members of Congress a foreign leader. When a president talks to a foreign leader, that's presumptively classified. And Clinton kept those tapes. And we sued the National Archives saying, you got to go get those tapes. Those are presidential records, aren't they? And the archive says, well, we don't have to do anything we don't want to do. And even more importantly, the court in our case, one of the most liberal justices or jurists in the District of Columbia, said not only that, but the president has the absolute right to determine what are his personal records versus presidential records, and no one can second guess it. And so when they started changing the rules to go after Trump, we blew the whistle. And of course, the Justice Department hated us for it. And they forced me to testify before a grand jury and harass Grand Judicial Watch with a subpoena as well. And that's where we are. I mean, that to me is the core dispute. Are they making up new rules to apply to Trump?
Well, so it's been reported in recent days by people who are watching this, and I think people who are more on Trump's side on these things, that all of this has fallen apart. And I will say, Trump has the golden touch. A lot of false accusations have been thrown his way, a lot of lawsuits, a lot of claims. And maybe in the short term, it hurts him. But it seems like with the benefit of time, most of the stuff usually he comes out the winner. I don't know if that's going to happen here, but some people are suggesting that these court cases are backfiring and they're all falling apart. What is your take on the kind of week we've had and where we are?
Well, the Supreme Court may kind of essentially undermine the basis of the two federal cases, the January 6th case in DC and the Florida case, the documents case, by grant or finding the president has immunity for acts he commits as president. His official act immunity. I don't know how else to describe it. And that will take the heart out of two of the cases in many ways. The Fannie Willis case is compromised. Who knows where it's going to go? The appellate court in Georgia just said they're going to hear the appeal of the failure to remove Fannie Willis. So that case is kind of in limbo. And the only case that's proceeding is the kangaroo court up in New York, which has zero credibility, but nevertheless is punishing. And this whole process is punishing. I appreciate that Trump seems to be benefiting politically from this, but potentially, I don't know, maybe he's benefiting that the trials are being used to elevate his name as an alternative. I don't know if the trials themselves benefit him.
Yeah.
I mean, heck, Sharyl, if politicians thought that getting indicted and being put on trial would be helpful, they'd be lined up at the Justice Department, confessing all sorts of crimes.
Yeah. Well, I think
I think it's kind of, you could,
sorry.
The analysis, anyone, who knows whether what the impact is, but it's not good for the country to have the courts and prosecutors abuse their powers by putting their thumbs on the scale during an election.
So in the big picture, again, I go back to people who are concerned about what's happening in our court system. Let's assume, for the sake of argument today, that Trump comes out of these things, no worse for the wear. And if it's even proven or widely seen as these were frivolous prosecutions or they shouldn't have been brought, let's say the one in New York, for all the reasons you mentioned, nothing ever happens to the people that do that. Like the prosecutors aren't going to get prosecuted. So where are we when the courts can be used, even if it's just for temporary benefit, even if they lose in the long run, but they can be used to punish and smear somebody for political purposes. And there seems to be nothing, I don't know what we could do about it.
Well, what are they doing against conservatives? They're disbarring lawyers who dared to dispute the election. So you do something that's perfectly normal and legitimate, they will disbar you and prosecute you. And the question for those of us concerned about what's going on now is, well, if lawyers and prosecutors or even judges do something that's illegitimate and in violation of the law, are we going to disbar them? Or are we going to prosecute them? Or are they even going to be subject to criminal investigation? And if I were the next president, or whoever the next honest president is, as soon as they get in, they should directly appoint a special counsel, not use the Justice Department, but use the president's power to appoint a special counsel personally to investigate this massive effort that's clearly coordinated, conspiratorial, to deprive President Trump of his civil rights under the color of law. And so everyone involved in the targeting of Trump should be subject to federal investigation by the next president.
Well, the only one I can see doing that, because Trump got talked out of doing anything like that when he was elected or changed his mind, And I think a lot of times Republicans decide or are convinced to turn the other cheek or whatever. I could see a Robert F. Kennedy, not that he's going to win the election, the Democrat turned independent. He sees, I think, this, what he calls corruption. I don't think he's a huge Trump fan, but he's spoken to what's happening to Trump, and he agrees with a lot of what you said. He might do something like that, but certainly Biden's not going to, and I don't even know if Trump would if he gets reelected.
Yeah, I hope Trump would. Biden obviously has a personal interest here. I mean, half of what's happening in Trump, we can argue whether it's half or all or what portion of it. A lot of it is distracting is a useful distraction from the significant evidence of criminality by Joe Biden and his family and the racketeering operations he seems to have been running likely from his Senate days that really has never stopped. So we'll see what happens. And you're right about the accountability. It's very frustrating, and I'm sure you hear this from your listeners and viewers and your readers, and we hear it too, is that the failure to take action against the corrupt class here in Washington, D.C. that's abused power like they have over the last several years is inexcusable.
Well, you brought up Biden and past alleged corruption, so we don't have to go off on too much of a tangent, but I have two thoughts about the Ukraine situation. I have not heard anybody suggest what the thought that's in the back of my head every time we give another $1 billion to Ukraine, every time the Biden administration does so, that Ukraine has a vested interest in pleasing Ukraine, because Ukraine and the government connected companies that Joe Biden's son worked for, they have information that could theoretically help prove or disprove certain allegations. They certainly know way more than we know about what happened with the sweetheart deals that Joe Biden's son got to work in Ukraine and so on. Isn't that a conflict of interest? I don't know how you'd avoid it, but no one's even speaking to the notion that Joe Biden is giving billions of dollars to the same country that's potentially holding secrets about his son in that case.
You raise a fair point. I wonder how, I jokingly say, I wonder how Burisma's doing during the war. But I think it's even broader than that, Sharyl. I think he's compromised, and I used to say he's compromised by the Russian side, but you highlight how he's compromised by both sides. Because Burisma, to me, was always a Russian-oriented company. And certainly you had these ties to Russia through the oligarch in Russia giving money to the Biden family. And the Russians, knowing full well what Biden was up to in Ukraine, they were onto it. Our FOIA records we've uncovered from the State Department show the Obama administration was very much aware that the Russians were trolling Biden for his anti-corruption efforts in Ukraine because they knew about Hunter being there. So to me, Biden's compromised 6 ways to Sunday in Ukraine. And that ought to be the discussion point on all issues related to U.S. policy towards Ukraine. And it helps explain why we've supported a war that seemingly its only goal is just to keep on people fighting with no result. He doesn't want the Russians to win. He certainly doesn't want them to lose.
My second related thought to that is we're constantly debating the fine points of, well, what was exactly said at a meeting that Hunter Biden had with certain foreign officials when he got Joe Biden on the phone. And I've always said, stepping way back, just looking at a 30,000-foot view, the day Joe Biden gave the interview and acknowledged that when his son was working for this Ukrainian company, that Joe Biden went over to Ukraine and threatened to withhold billions of taxpayer dollars in aid, maybe it was $1 billion, if they didn't fire the prosecutor that was targeting the company that Joe Biden's son was working at, sort of a blackmail situation, you could argue, and got his way. And he admits this on camera. That's enough. I mean, I don't think you have to go any further to say something really, really bad allegedly happened. Use of our taxpayer money to convince a foreign nation to do something that was in a personal interest of, at the time he was vice president, and his son?
Well, the last person who raised a substantial question about that was Donald Trump, and they impeached him for it.
Yeah.
I
Well,
mean, I think your analysis is right, and it shows you just how corrupt the regime is. And you can have a regime where someone else is nominally running things, like Trump was.
Yeah.
He was against the regime, and they went after him.
So I'll be working on a story you might be interested this summer for season 10 of my TV show Full Measure, about the trends really around the world. I'm not an expert in this, but I will be getting more up to speed on it. But there are what we call populists being elected, or at least trying to be elected around the world, being fought, much like Donald Trump, by what we would call the establishment. Sometimes they're left, sometimes they're right, but always they're this establishment force that does not like seeing the people, populism, elect someone who threatens the bureaucracy establishment that considers itself more important than the views of the voters and the people. And I think this isn't just what's happening here in this country. And I'm told by my friends in Brazil and other places, happening around the world. So I'm going to be reporting on that, probably doing interviews in Europe with some of these populist leaders. And I thought of this a couple of years ago because people would tell me about populism almost like it was a bad thing. And I'm like, well, what is it? And why is it bad? Populism, popular. But it is a bad thing to the establishment forces. We might call that the deep state or the federal bureaucracy. I call it the persistent bureaucracy here, because they're threatened by those leaders who come in and aren't part of that. Do you have any thoughts on that before we go?
Yeah, I think you highlight, and stories like that highlight. I think the story is a true one, and your reporting will be useful. Highlight that the battle we're facing on those issues, in terms of the rule of law being abused and thrown out the window to target Trump, it's not only a kind of an attack on the American way, but it's a civilizational battle that is going on throughout the West, where the deep states in countries A through Z engaged in the same type of behavior. And there's a transnational consensus to censor and jail political opponents of the powers that be, which are often of the far left, or the institutional entities running countries, whether they be intelligence, or the social welfare state. Let's give them some credit too. And climate change, the environmental wackos. Let's give them some credit too for trying to destroy their enemies. It's a broad issue, and Trump is, unfortunately for the West and the future of the world, is just one skirmish in the war.
Well, thank you for keeping up the fight to reveal these freedom of information documents that the government keeps such a tight hold on, even though we own them. You get so many of them that I can't get, because they know that, well, once in a while I'm successful. I think sometimes you guys have helped, but most often, even if I win a case, even if I have time to challenge or the money, I get a rolling production, they call it. You'll get 300 documents a month for I pointed out to one judge when there was a CDC order that they had to turn over some information on a disease they were really trying not to release information about. And whatever was agreed upon, so they hid the information they weren't supposed to because it's public, but then the judge says, okay, you can release X hundred per whatever. And I pointed out it would be something like 21 years before I would get the material that I needed for an imminent news story some years before, when I first asked for it. And the judge was like, yeah, that is a little ridiculous. Can you produce it a little bit faster? But you guys have a lot more success. You're experts at this, and I really appreciate the documents you've been able to get. I'm always looking for those. And
yeah, that's a challenge. You remind me, there was a story, we had a similar case, and we complained that the document production schedule is going to take years for the production to be complete, and then only then could we fight over records that they withheld. So it really stalls things terribly. And the judge says, well, too bad, you just get the documents when you get them. And then a few years later, the same judge is like, well, why is this case taking so long to resolve?
And nothing ever happens to them. Like, I think the judges, the minute they make a decision that says you should have turned these documents over, there should be some kind of serious sanction that would stop this behavior, but nothing happens to them. So they, there's no problem with them continuing. But thank you for what
the
you
FOIA
do.
law is good, but not strong enough. I agree.
Yeah. Well, let's keep in touch. There's a lot more
Thank you,
we can
Sharyl.
talk about. I appreciate it.
Appreciate your work in journalism as well. Thank you.